The New York Times have faced internal upheaval since October 7th over their coverage of Israel's war in Gaza. But now it has emerged that the paper has instructed journalists to restrict the use of the terms genocide and ethnic cleansing and to avoid the phrase occupied territory when describing Palestinian land. Not only that, they have told journalists not to use the word Palestine except in very rare cases. This story is coming from The Intercept, who obtained a copy of the internal memo, which was first distributed to New York Times journalists in November. The memo also outlines that reporters shouldn't use the term refugee camps to describe areas of Gaza where displaced Palestinians are now being located after being expelled from other parts of Palestine during previous Israeli-Arab wars. The Intercept say this. The memo, written by Times Standards editor Susan Westling, international editor Philip Pan, and their deputies, quote, offers guidance about some terms and other issues we have grappled with since the start of the conflict in October. While the document is presented as an outline for maintaining objective journalistic principles in reporting on the Gaza war, several Times staffers told The Intercept that some of its contents show evidence of the paper's deference to Israeli narratives. One New York Times newsroom source who requested anonymity said this to The Intercept about the memo. I think it's the kind of thing that looks professional and logical if you have no knowledge of the historical context of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. But if you do know, it will be clear how apologetic it is to Israel. On the memo's direction of the term occupied territories, it says this. When possible, avoid the term and be specific, e.g. Gaza, the West Bank, etc., as each has a slightly different status. So here they're referring to the fact that Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem are all considered to be occupied Palestinian territories in the eyes of the UN and most of the world. In relation to the term occupied territories being discouraged, an NYT staffer said this. You are basically taking the occupation out of the coverage, which is the actual core of the conflict. It's like, oh, let's not say occupation because it might make it look like we're justifying a terrorist attack. The memo also includes some advice about how to describe a one-sided war that's seen the number killed on one side grow to nearly 30 times more than those killed on the other. Quote, the nature of the conflict has led to inflammatory language and incendiary accusations on all sides. We should be very cautious about using such language, even in quotations. Our goal is to provide clear, accurate information, and heated language can often obscure rather than clarify the fact. Words like slaughter, massacre, and carnage often convey more emotion than information. Think hard before using them in our own voice. That advice minimizes the scale of death being imposed by Israel on Gaza and the manner in which it's being carried out. But it's also hypocritical. The Intercept's own analysis of articles written in the New York Times shows that between October 7th and November 24th last year, the paper has described Israelis being killed as a massacre on 53 occasions. Of the many, many times that Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, the New York Times has referred to a massacre just once. Remember, this is a war in which Israel has killed at least 15,000 children. And when it comes to using the word slaughter, the New York Times was happy to use it 22 times to refer to Israeli deaths, and just once for Palestinians. Now, this is the paper of record for the United States. It's the one that goes in the archives. But the memo also instructed journalists to avoid terms like genocide and ethnic cleansing, except in specific legal contexts. But then again, it got very prescriptive about what terms writers should use. This is the guidance on how to refer to Hamas fighters. It is accurate to use the term terrorism and terrorist in describing the acts of October 7th, which included the deliberate targeting of civilians in killings and kidnappings. We should not shy away from that description of the event or the attackers, particularly when we provide context and explanation. Avoid fighters when referring to the October 7th attack. The term suggests a conventional war rather than a deliberate attack on civilians. And be cautious in using militants, which is interpreted in different ways and may be confusing to readers. The thing is here is fighter is a purely descriptive term, whereas terrorist is arguably much more emotive and loaded, which is something the New York Times guidance said should be avoided. But also, I await the moment that the Times tells its journalists to start referring to the IDF, whose indiscriminate attacks has inevitably caused death to civilians, as being terrorists. After 6 months of relentless and targeted attacks on Palestinian civilians in Gaza, I'm sure it's coming any day now. But anyway, let's hear what the NYT had to say in response. A spokesperson said this. Issuing guidance like this is to ensure accuracy, consistency, and nuance in how we cover the news in standard practice. Across all our reporting, including complex events like this, we take care to ensure our language and choices are sensitive, current, and clear to our audiences. Helena, what do you make of this memo?
First of all, I'd just like to say big ups to Ryan Grimm at The Intercept for his excellent reporting over the course of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And this is just another excellent piece of evidence from him and what good work he's done in ensuring we have some good coverage on this. Well, this is another instance of what is just false balance, right? It's this level of false balance. Now, Emily Maitlis talks about this in the run-up to the Brexit coverage by saying, well, we have to have both sides of a discussion being given equal time on this, regardless of the merit of what they're saying here. Now, whilst I disagree with Emily Maitlis necessarily about how the BBC conducts that necessarily, I think that kind of dynamic is exactly what's going on here. The New York Times is saying, well, we can't have these specific words or these specific descriptions being used because they might alter somebody to one side of the conflict here. Except the two sides they're trying to apportion balance to are the specific US State Department description of something and the broad international consensus on the other, as if these are two viewpoints of kind of equal weight, when they just are not. They just completely aren't. Take, for example, the not allowing the description in terms of occupied territory. This is the legal definition of what Israel engages in with regards to the Palestinian territories. Again, as I said before, 50-year belligerent occupation of the Palestinian territories, continually having been doing so, condemned by countries around the world, but continually supported by the United States and other Western countries without any actual real criticism of what's going on there, up until very recently with some criticism of illegal settlers, because they're allies. They're allies to the West. They're allies to the United States. And therefore, they will give too much weight to a very specific US State Department line on this, even though it's with kind of zero merit whatsoever under the guise of balance, which is nonsensical. All it does is cover up the fact that there is US complicity in the funding, support, and the way that they've ignored and allowed Israel to engage in its land grabs and its occupation with complete impunity and with no ability to ever undermine it, because we already see that when it comes to UN Security Council meetings, the one country that continually defends Israel regardless of what they do has been the United States. One thing I think was really key, though, is the not being able to describe areas of where Palestinian refugees are living as refugee camps. I found this a really, really kind of telling piece of this in the throughout kind of the New York Times reporting of this. Remember, they were the one to break the story around, or one of the other outlets, I should say, who broke the story, quote unquote, about the Israeli dossier alleging all of this UNRWA involvement with Hamas, which again is one of the reasons why there's all this discussion over whether or not you can describe the Palestinians as refugees. The Israeli narrative on this one, specifically the Hasbara narrative on this, is that, oh, well, you can't call these people refugees because we kicked them out of their homes in 1948, or their parents or whatever. And UNRWA is the group that they wanted to try and undermine, because UNRWA treats the people who live in these refugee camps, because they are the children of those who were displaced during the Nakba, they refuse to treat them as refugees. And specifically, Israel doesn't like this, because the points of inflection of the peace talks and of the Israel-Palestine peace process is the fact that Israel will not adhere to UN Resolution 194 of the Palestinian right of return. And they want to ensure that that never happens by trying to make sure that people who do live in refugee camps are not treated as refugees. So the language, even the language specifically of not even describing refugees as refugees or the places they live as camps based upon the way they've been displaced, very, very telling as how it essentially dovetails into specific pro-Israel narratives on how they want the broader conflict discussed. One last point as well is it's just another instance with this regard that we can't say massacre, you can't say slaughter, unless of course it's against Israel, right? If Israel have their civilians killed, it's a massacre, it's a slaughter. But if Palestinians do, then it's just collateral damage of a justified military attack or whatever it might be. Again, because when they won't use the word to describe it as occupied territories, that might let people know that this is an ongoing conflict in which, under international law, occupied people have a right to resist their occupation. Because if you talk about massacres and slaughters of civilians, that is, again, I do agree that it's a motive, but you have to be balanced in how you cover this. And the fact they will use it against the people who are against US interests but won't use it for Israel, incredibly telling, alongside all of the huge number of instances we've seen of the difference between active and passive voice across not just the NYT, but broader Western media on this, where they'll just say Palestinians have died, rather than Hamas militants or Hamas terrorists, as the NYT would prefer. Hamas terrorists will kill, for example, Israeli civilians. Now that is true. Hamas militants did kill Israeli civilians, but they'll never use that active voice when it comes to the deliberate attacks that we know kill civilians deliberately based upon the 972 expose of Lavender. They never use those same words for Israel actually killing civilians across the Palestinian territories. And at least now we know this isn't just some level of manufacturing consent that's implicit. It's being explicitly told in these guidelines to reporters in papers of record. This is how they have to discuss the conflict.
Yeah, I think that low grade kind of systemic dehumanization and relative humanization is what we see here, where it's, when the use of very clinical and robotic language when it comes to describing the plight of Palestinians, as you said, that passive voice of Palestinians have died, or Palestinian casualties or whatever. Whereas when describing violence committed against Israelis, the language is humanizing because it conveys suffering and it conveys pain. Whereas it's almost as if Palestinians, when they experience loss or when they experience injury, when they are killed, it's somehow painless, it's somehow mechanical and sterile. And when that happens on an ongoing, when that happens consistently, it creates this low-grade dehumanization that then makes it, paves the way for further violence to take place. And I think also this demand for, under the guise of accuracy, for clinical language when it comes to one side, and yet the allowance of emotive language on the other side, just goes to show how when wielded selectively, this kind of idea of protocol or rules-based order can become extremely destructive.